Imagine standing at the altar, waiting for the love of your life to walk through the chapel doors. But she never comes. Guests whisper. The organ plays again. And still nothing. Hours pass. Panic spreads. And what was meant to be the happiest day of your life becomes every family's worst nightmare. This is the story of Anna Collins, the bride who never made it to the altar. Meadowbrook, Pennsylvania, population just under 4,000. A town so small that when the church bell rang, everyone knew who it was for. It was June 14, 1996. A warm, clear morning. The air smelled of lilacs and cut grass. Inside St. Mary's Chapel, ribbons of white satin hung from the pews. Rows of fresh roses lined the aisle. It was supposed to be the perfect summer wedding. Anna Collins had been planning this day since she was a teenager. 26 years old. A Sunday school teacher. Sweet, soft-spoken, always helping someone. The kind of person people trusted without question. Her fiancé, Mark Lawson, was 28. A quiet mechanic who worked at his father's auto shop. Steady, dependable, the kind of man who rarely spoke but always showed up. Everyone said they were perfect for each other. Two kids who grew up side by side in the same small town, now about to start a new chapter. Only, that chapter never began. At 9:45 a.m., Anna was seen leaving her parents' farmhouse on Maple Creek Road. She was wearing her white rehearsal robe, carrying a cup of coffee, smiling as she waved to her neighbor, Mrs. Duffy. Mrs. Duffy, in an interview, said Anna looked radiant. You could tell she was happy. Said she was going to get her hair done. I remember her saying, "See you at the church." That's the last time I ever saw her. She never made it to the salon. She never made it to the chapel. By noon, the bridesmaids were panicking. By 1 o'clock, her mother was crying on the phone to the sheriff. And by 2, the church was filled with whispers and dread. Inside St. Mary's, guests sat waiting. The organist played the same song 3 times before stopping. The air grew thick. Mark sat at the front, staring at the double doors, still believing they'd open at any moment. But they never did. Because somewhere between her parents' home and the salon on Main Street, Anna Collins simply vanished. Around 2:30 p.m., a local farmer named Jim Weller spotted a white 1991 Honda Civic parked along the old country road that curved toward the creek. The driver's door was slightly open. At first, he thought someone had pulled over for a walk. But when he slowed down, something caught his eye. A bouquet of roses resting on the front seat. He called the sheriff's office. Within the hour, Sheriff Dale Mercer, a man who'd known the Collins family all his life, arrived on scene. Sheriff Mercer, in a press briefing, said, "We found no signs of a struggle. Keys were in the ignition. Purse was gone. But there were footprints leading away from the car. Rain had washed most of them out, so we couldn't tell whose they were." Inside the car, investigators found the bouquet, her wedding planner, and a torn note in Anna's handwriting that read, "If something happens to me, tell Ma." The rest of the page was missing. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. People left casseroles on the Collins porch. Reporters showed up. Helicopters hovered over the woods behind Maple Creek Road. It was the kind of story that small towns never forget. Everyone had a theory. Some said Anna got cold feet. Some said she ran away with someone else. And others whispered about darker things, that someone didn't want this wedding to happen. Naturally, suspicion turned toward Mark Lawson, the groom. He told investigators they'd spoken briefly that morning before she left home. Mark Lawson said Anna was excited. She said she couldn't wait to see me at the altar. She said it felt like a dream. There was nothing wrong. But rumors soon began to surface. About tension at the rehearsal dinner, about an argument over a letter Anna had received a week before the wedding. A letter she refused to show anyone. Mark's family swore by his innocence. Anna's parents weren't so sure. Emerus Collins said Mark loved her. But something changed those last few weeks. Anna had been quieter, almost scared. I just didn't know why. 2 nights after Anna's disappearance, her parents received a phone call from an unknown number. The call lasted 12 seconds. Mrs. Collins answered. First, only static. Then a voice. "MRS. Collins said the person on the call sounded like Anna. She was crying. She said, "Mom, I didn't mean to find it." Then the line went dead. Investigators traced the call. It came from a payphone near the old Hawthorne Mill, a long-abandoned textile factory on the edge of town. When deputies arrived, they found the phone still off the hook, and something lying on the ground beneath it, a gold locket. It was Anna's. Inside was a small photograph of her and Mark on their first date at the county fair. But on the back of the locket, faintly scratched into the metal, were 3 chilling words. "The well knows. In Meadowbrook people talk." And by the 3rd day, the disappearance had already become legend. The story of the bride who never made it to the altar. Some said she fell into the old quarry. Some swore they saw her near the mill that night. Others whispered she discovered something. Something buried. Something she wasn't meant to see. But the truth was stranger than anyone imagined. For 20 years, her name would echo through Meadowbrook like a ghost story. But in 2016, 2 decades later, a storm would unearth something that brought the case back to life. And what that storm revealed changed everything the town thought it knew about what happened to Anna Collins. 20 years had passed since the morning Anna Collins vanished. Meadowbrook had changed. New houses, new families. But the story never faded. The town still spoke her name in whispers. And then, one summer night in 2016, a storm rolled through that would bring her story back to the surface. Literally. It was the kind of storm the town hadn't seen in decades. Lightning struck the old water tower. The creek overflowed, swallowing fences and flooding the fields around Hawthorne Mill Road. By dawn, trees had been uprooted, roads washed out, and the old mill, long abandoned and forgotten, had half its foundation exposed. That morning, Deputy Sarah Keene was dispatched to check for flood damage. She'd grown up hearing about the Collins case. It was the first story her parents ever told her to be afraid of. When she arrived at the site, mist hung over the ruins. The mill's stone walls were cracked, the roof half collapsed, and near what used to be the drainage tunnel, she noticed something strange. A section of earth that had caved in. First, she thought it was debris, but as she stepped closer, the beam of her flashlight caught something metallic glinting beneath the mud. She brushed away the dirt and found a wedding shoe. White satin, caked in clay, its heel snapped clean off. Inside, embedded in the sole, was a small gold thread. She radioed it in. By midday, sheriff's deputies, forensic teams, and half the town were standing behind the old caution tape, watching as the area was excavated. What they found next would silence Meadowbrook for weeks. Buried roughly 3 feet beneath the surface was a wooden box, sealed shut and reinforced with rusted nails. Inside the box lay several objects. A torn bridal veil, a faded wedding invitation addressed to Anna Collins and Mark Lawson, and a cassette tape, marked only with the date June 12, 1996, 2 days before. The recording was faint, filled with static, but parts were clear enough to chill the room. In the cassette tape was Anna's recording. "If anyone finds this, I think I'm being watched. I don't know who, but they keep leaving things at my door, notes, flowers. I thought it was Mark at first, but it isn't his handwriting." There was a long pause. Anna continued. "Last night someone was outside the house. I heard them whisper my name. I told Dad it was just the wind, but I know it wasn't. Something's wrong with the mill, with what they found there. If anything happens to me, tell Mom I'm sorry." The tape ended with a sound, a faint knock, then silence. By the following week, the state police had reopened the case. Sheriff Dale Mercer, now retired, was brought in as a consultant. Mercer said in an interview, "I never stopped thinking about that girl. You don't just forget something like that. Finding that tape, it was like she was still speaking to us, 20 years later." The new sheriff assigned the case to Detective Claire Monroe, a young investigator from Philadelphia who had a reputation for solving cold cases. Claire was methodical, quiet, patient, always observing. When she arrived in Meadowbrook, the first thing she did was visit the site of the discovery. She stood there for a long time, staring at the exposed soil and the outline of where the box had been buried. Claire recorded field notes that, Whoever buried this didn't want to hide her body. They wanted to hide her voice. For the first time in years, the Collins name was back in headlines. TV vans lined Main Street. Reporters interviewed old classmates, friends, former church members. One interview stood out. Lily Green, Anna's maid of honor, now in her 40s, agreed to speak on record. Lily said, "Anna told me something weird the week before the wedding. She said she'd gone back to the old mill. I told her not to, it's dangerous there. But she said she had to see it again. I asked what she meant and she said, 'The thing we found when we were teenagers, I can't stop thinking about it.'" I didn't know what she was talking about. Detective Monroe took note of that. Claire Field notes, "The mill again, the past. Whatever Anna saw there years earlier might be connected to her disappearance." After the flood, reporters sought out Mark Lawson, the fiancé who never remarried, who'd left Meadowbrook 15 years ago. He was now living 2 states away, working as a mechanic in Ohio. When detectives reached out, Mark agreed to speak reluctantly. Mark Lawson said, "I don't know what else I can say. She was my whole life. I didn't hurt her. I didn't even know she'd gone to the mill again. We used to go there when we were kids. Found some old journals, weird carvings on the walls. She said she had nightmares about it sometimes." Claire pressed him for details. "Claire, what kind of carvings?" Mark, "Circles. Words I couldn't read. But she said one of them spelled her name." That detail sent a chill through the investigation. How could Anna's name have been carved into the walls of a building abandoned long before she was born? A week later, crime scene analysts cataloging the items from the flood site found something they hadn't noticed before. A photo fragment stuck to the underside of the wedding veil. It showed 2 people, Anna and someone else, standing near the mill, smiling faintly at the camera. But the photo was torn, and only the edge of the second person's face remained visible. Analysts enhanced the image. What they found made Detective Monroe's heart stop. It wasn't Mark Lawson. The man in the picture was someone else entirely. The discovery of that photograph would change the course of the entire investigation. Because whoever that man was, he was with Anna in her final days. And finding out who he was would uncover the truth that Meadowbrook had buried for 2 decades. But the answer to who he was would come from someone no one expected. Someone who'd been keeping a secret since the day Anna disappeared. The image was blurry, the kind of photograph you'd take with a disposable Kodak in the 1990s. Anna was smiling, but faintly, as if distracted. Behind her was the crumbling wall of the mill, its bricks mottled and green from decades of damp air. And next to her, just at the edge of the frame, stood a man with dark hair, his face half cut off by the torn side of the photo. At first, detectives assumed it might be Mark Lawson, Anna's fiancé. But when forensic analysts restored the image digitally, the resemblance vanished. The man's jawline, his clothes, even the height difference, none of it matched. Whoever he was, he'd been with Anna days before the wedding. And that meant there was someone else in her life. Someone the town never knew about. Detective Claire Monroe had the photo enlarged, printed, and pinned on the investigation board. Next to it, the wedding invitation, the cassette tape, and a map of Meadowbrook marking key locations. The Collins residence, St. Luke's Church, and the ruins of Hawthorne Mill. Claire Field notes read, "If Anna was meeting someone at the mill, it wasn't random. Someone lured her there, or someone she trusted asked her to come." She began by tracing the photograph's physical evidence. The torn edge contained faint writing, a number scrawled in ink, almost invisible until magnified. #12 Roll B. A clue. Back in the 1990s, wedding photographers used film rolls labeled alphabetically. If this photo was Roll B, then there might have been a Roll A, perhaps part of Anna's missing wedding album. Claire located the original wedding photographer, Arthur Blake, now 78 years old and living in a retirement home 2 towns over. When she showed him the image, his face went pale. "Arthur, interview. That's one of mine. I shot that series 2 days before the ceremony, engagement portraits near the old mill." She insisted on that location. Said it meant something special to her and Mark. "But that man, that's not Mark. I don't know who that is." Claire, "You're sure you took this?" "Arthur, positive. I even remember the camera, a Nikon F3. Still had half a roll left when I got home. But when I went to develop it, the negatives were gone. Someone had taken them." Claire's pen froze mid-note. "Claire, who had access?" "Arthur, only 2 people. Me, and the person who picked up the roll before I got to the studio. Said she was a family friend. Blonde hair. Drove a white Buick. Signed her name, L. Green. That name again, Lily Green, Anna's best friend and maid of honor. The same woman who said she didn't know what Anna meant when she mentioned returning to the mill." Claire drove straight to Lily's home on the outskirts of town. The house was tidy, surrounded by wilted hydrangeas and a half-painted porch. Lily was cautious when she opened the door. "Claire, Lily, I'm investigating the Collins case. We spoke before. I need to ask you something about a photograph." "Lily, I told you everything I know." "Claire, you signed out a film roll from Arthur Blake's studio in 1996. Roll B. Why?" Lily hesitated. Her eyes shifted toward the window before she whispered, "Lily, because she asked me to." Claire leaned in. "Claire, Anna." "Lily, she called me that morning. Said there were pictures that couldn't be developed, that someone might see them." She sounded scared. "Claire, did you see the photos?" "Lily, no. She told me to burn them, but I didn't. I hid them under her bed, wrapped in an old quilt." Lily kept a small metal tin, rusted at the hinges. Inside were 3 photographs. Anna standing by the mill. Anna and the unknown man, closer now, almost holding hands. A blurred shot of the man alone, standing by what looked like a cellar door beneath the mill. "Claire, quietly, that's not just the mill. That's an entrance." "Lily, an entrance to what?" "Claire, that's what I'm going to find out." The man's face was still partially obscured, but now clearer. Mid-30s, dark jacket, narrow eyes. Claire sent the image to the FBI's missing persons database for cross-reference. While she waited, she began digging through Old Town records. The mill, she learned, had once belonged to the Carter family, who sold it to the town in 1947. But in the 1970s, it was leased to a local craftsman who used it as a workshop before disappearing. His name? Daniel Carter, a local carpenter known for restoring church pews and wedding furniture. In a photograph from 1978, taken at a county fair, Daniel Carter bore a striking resemblance to the man in Anna's photo. Claire recording. If that's Daniel Carter, he'd have been in his 40s when Anna met him. But records say he vanished in 1980. So how is he standing beside her 16 years later? 3 days later, the FBI report came back. Facial analysis. 82% match, Daniel Carter. Presumed missing since 1980. Never declared dead. Claire read the report twice. The timeline didn't make sense, unless Daniel Carter hadn't disappeared at all. What if he'd gone into hiding? In Meadowbrook. That night, Claire returned to the mill with Deputy Keene. The air was still heavy with the scent of wet earth. They searched near the collapsed wall where the photo had been taken. After an hour, Claire's flashlight hit something buried beneath moss and debris. A door handle, half-rusted, leading to a narrow stairwell that descended into darkness. Claire said, "There." The cellar from the photo. The wooden steps creaked under her boots as she descended. The air was damp, cold, silent, until her beam landed on something at the bottom. An old workbench, covered in dust. And beside it, a hand-carved wedding chest, unfinished, with Anna's name etched faintly into the wood. Claire froze. Her recorder picked up her voice, trembling slightly. Claire believed he was building her a gift. Then, in the quiet, something clattered in the dark. Metal hitting stone. Claire turned her light and caught the glint of a bracelet, half buried in the dirt. A bracelet engraved with the initials, ACML, Anna Collins, Mark Lawson. The cellar beneath the mill had been sealed for 2 decades. And inside, detectives found a clue that tied Anna back to her fiancé, the man she was supposed to marry. But what they didn't know was that the bracelet wasn't the only thing down there. There was something else. Something that had been waiting all these years to be found. What Claire discovered in the shadows would rewrite everything the town believed about Anna's disappearance, and about the man she thought she loved. Beneath the ruins of the old Hawthorne Mill, a hidden cellar sat untouched for nearly 30 years. Down there, time had stopped. The walls still smelled faintly of sawdust and smoke, and on one table, a gift that was never finished. Detective Claire Monroe crouched beside the wooden chest. Her flashlight beam moved across its weathered surface. Fine craftsmanship, meticulous carvings. The words Anna and Mark had been etched with deliberate care, though the mark looked hurried, almost resentful, as if added later by another hand. Inside the chest, layers of decayed lace and paper clung together. At the bottom, a dried rose flattened against the wood, and beneath that, a small velvet pouch sealed shut with a frayed ribbon. Claire slipped on gloves and opened it. Inside was a ring, not Anna's engagement ring, that had been recovered from her dressing table the morning she disappeared. This one was older, worn thin by decades of use. A man's wedding band, engraved with the initials DC. Daniel Carter, the man in the photograph. The discovery connected two timelines: Daniel Carter, who disappeared in 1980, and Anna Collins, who vanished in 1996. If the ring was his, it meant he'd been alive 16 years after he was presumed dead. But why the secrecy? Why the cellar? A deeper search of the room revealed more unsettling clues. Cot pushed against the wall. An oil lantern, empty food tins stacked neatly, and pinned above the bed, a yellowed clipping from the Meadowbrook Gazette dated April 1980. The headline read, "Local carpenter accused of obsession with bride-to-be." Claire's heart stopped. She unfolded the brittle paper. The article described a scandal decades earlier. Daniel Carter, accused of stalking a woman named Margaret Hale after building her wedding furniture. Margaret disappeared shortly after, and Carter fled town, never to be seen again. Now, history seemed to be repeating itself. Back at the station, Claire requested old property files related to the mill. Hours later, a voice buzzed through her office intercom. "Archivist, Detective Monroe? There's something you should see. One of the signatures on the lease records from 1995. It's not Mark Lawson's. The tenant who reactivated the lease for storage use was someone named D. Carter." "Claire, you're telling me Daniel Carter legally rented that property a year before Anna vanished?" "Archivist. Exactly. Using an address that doesn't exist anymore." To piece the timeline together, Claire sought out locals who might remember the mill's last days. That led her to Ellen Ford, now 82, who had lived near the property since childhood. Ellen's memory was sharp, and her recollection chilling. Ellen interview. "I remember seeing him, the man with the truck. Used to come by every week before the wedding. Said he was fixing the old pipes. Sometimes the bride-to-be came with him. Sweet girl, nervous smile. Always wore a blue scarf." "Claire, you're certain it was Anna Collins?" Ellen. "Oh yes, I didn't forget that face. But the strange thing is, one night I saw her leave the mill alone. And behind her, that man was standing by the door, just watching. Didn't move, didn't wave. Like he knew she wasn't coming back." As Claire processed Ellen's testimony, a lab report came in. Something recovered from the dirt near the workbench in the cellar. A fragment of paper, leather-bound, fragile but legible. It was part of a journal. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and emotional. "She reminds me of her. Same voice, same kindness. I never meant to hurt anyone. But the vows are broken, and now she belongs to the earth again." No signature, but the style matched known samples of Daniel Carter's notes from his 1970s workshop receipts. Claire said quietly, "He didn't just know Anna. He thought she was someone else." As the investigation deepened, forensic technicians enhanced the rest of the film Lily Green had hidden. One final frame, long overlooked, revealed something haunting. The same cellar, the workbench, and in the corner a shape that looked disturbingly human. It was blurred, out of focus, but distinctly visible. a white dress sleeve, a hand. Claire's blood ran cold. She immediately ordered a deeper excavation of the mill basement. This time, a full forensic dig. 2 days later, the excavation team uncovered a sealed brick chamber beneath the floor. It was small, barely large enough for a person to crouch inside. When they broke it open, the stale air carried a faint, unmistakable scent of decay. And inside they found fabric, lace, ribbon, silk, and bones. Partial remains, wrapped carefully in a tattered piece of wedding gown. No identification, not yet. But next to the bones lay an object no one expected. A silver locket, tarnished but intact. Inside was a photo of Anna Collins, and beside her, Daniel Carter. The town of Meadowbrook had waited decades for answers. But the cellar beneath the mill only raised more questions. Who was Anna really meeting in those final days? Why did Daniel Carter return after 16 years of silence? And if those remains belonged to her, then who placed the cassette tape under the boards years later? As the forensics team packed their findings, Claire stood outside, watching the rain streak across her windshield. Something about the timeline still felt wrong, too neat, too perfect. And then her phone buzzed. It was Lily Green. Her voice was shaking. Lily on phone. Claire, it's Mark. I just saw him at the church. Claire, that's impossible. Lily. He was standing in the choir balcony, watching me, and when I called his name, he smiled. For nearly 30 years, Mark Lawson was remembered as the man left standing at the altar, the groom whose bride vanished before saying "I do." But in the small town of Meadowbrook, even legends can be rewritten. Because when he returned, he didn't come back for closure. He came back with secrets of his own. It was late evening when Detective Claire Monroe pulled up to St. Luke's Church. The call from Lily Green still echoed in her head. He was watching me from the balcony. The church was empty now. The wooden pews glowed under dim light, dust motes swirling through the air like old ghosts. And yet, there on the altar rail, Claire noticed something. A single white rose, freshly cut, laid atop a faded wedding program dated June 7, 1996. The name printed beneath the gold lettering. Anna Collins and Mark Lawson. Claire found Mark the next morning, sitting quietly in the corner of Miller's Diner, sipping black coffee. He looked older, worn down. The years had carved deep lines around his eyes, but his voice was calm. Too calm. Claire. Mr. Lawson, it's been a long time. Mark. Not long enough. Some things shouldn't come back. Claire. Lily said you were at the church. Mark. I visit once a year. On our anniversary. Claire. That's not what she described. Mark. She's always seen ghosts in every shadow. Claire leaned forward. Claire. Then maybe you can explain this. She slid a photograph across the table, the enhanced image of Anna standing beside Daniel Carter. For the first time, Mark's composure cracked. He blinked hard, his jaw tightening. Mark. Where did you get that? Claire. From the mill. We believe this was taken 2 days before your wedding. Mark. That's not possible. He's dead. Claire. You knew him. Mark. Everyone in this town knew him, though most have tried to forget. Mark stared down at the photograph, the coffee between his hands now trembling. Mark said quietly, when I was a kid, Daniel Carter worked for my father. Fixed furniture, helped around the farm. He was strange, always watching people like he saw something they didn't. Then one day he just vanished. They said he ran off after the Hale girl disappeared. Claire. Margaret Hale. Mark. Yes. My mother used to tell me to stay away from the mill. Said it was cursed. But I didn't listen. I went there once when I was 16. Found carvings all over the beams. Initials, dates, and a name etched deeper than the rest. Claire. Whose name? Mark. Anna Collins. Claire froze. Claire. That's impossible. Anna wasn't even born then. Mark. I know. That's why I never told anyone. As their conversation unfolded, Claire began to realize something. Mark wasn't shocked that Daniel Carter might have returned. He was terrified. Claire. Tell me about the days before the wedding. Did Anna act differently? Mark. She was distracted, always sneaking off. Said she was visiting her mother's grave. But I knew that wasn't true. One night I followed her. She drove to the edge of town, the mill road. I saw another car waiting there. Claire? And you didn't confront her? Mark? No. I thought maybe it was stress, cold feet. But then she came home crying. Said she made a mistake and it was all her fault. I never saw her again. Claire? Did she say what the mistake was? Mark? Only that she'd let someone back into her life who shouldn't have been there. Before leaving, Mark agreed to let Claire inspect his late parents' farmhouse, the place where he and Anna had planned to live after the wedding. In the attic, beneath boxes of old furniture and dust-covered memories, they found a cedar trunk sealed shut with a rusted latch. Inside, stacks of unopened wedding gifts, wrapped in faded paper. But among them was one that stood out, a small wooden box carved with the initials DC. Inside it, a note written in delicate cursive. For Anna, so you'll never forget our promise. D. And beneath the note, a small figurine. A carved bride and groom, hand-painted and cracked with age. Claire, recorder. This box was delivered before the wedding. No return address. The handwriting matches Daniel Carter's confirmed letters from 1978. Which means someone, perhaps Carter himself, sent this gift 16 years after he supposedly disappeared. Later that night, as Claire reviewed her notes at the station, a call came through dispatch. Radio. Unit 3, respond to 42 Birch Lane. Possible break-in at the Lawson residence. When she arrived, the front door was ajar. Mark was gone. The living room had been torn apart. Papers, drawers, shattered glass everywhere. And on the wall, scrawled in black marker, a message. You promised her you'd never tell. Among the debris, Claire noticed a faint hum. A small cassette player lying on the floor, still running. She pressed stop, then play. A man's voice filled the room. Shaky. Hoarse. It was Mark. Mark on tape. If you're hearing this, it means I was right. He never died. He's been here all along. Watching, waiting. I think he took her, but not because he hated me. Because he thought she was someone else. He called her Margaret. He said she'd finally come home. The tape clicked off. And in the silence, a floorboard creaked upstairs. Claire froze. She raised her flashlight, slowly, and began to climb the stairs one step at a time. At the top, the hall stretched dark and still, until she noticed something on the floor. Muddy footprints, leading toward the master bedroom. And there, on the door, a small carved symbol. The same one found on the beam inside the mill. The same one Daniel Carter had etched beside Anna's name decades before. Detective Monroe was beginning to realize something terrible, that the past wasn't finished with Meadowbrook, because someone was still out there, carrying on Daniel Carter's promise, and they'd just come back to keep it. Sometimes, small towns keep their peace by burying their secrets. Not in the ground, but in bloodlines. And in Meadowbrook, one name seems to rise through every tragedy, every missing girl, every whispered story of the woods. Carter. A name that's been here longer than the roads themselves, and maybe the reason no bride ever made it home. Detective Claire Monroe hadn't slept. By dawn, the Lawson home was sealed off, yellow tape glinting under the cold morning sun. Mark Lawson was still missing. The note scrawled on the wall, "You promised her you'd never tell," now served as the only clue. But the words "you'd never tell" stuck with her. Tell what? As officers searched the property, Claire turned her attention to the attic, to the carved box she'd found. Inside, beneath the figurine and note, was something else she hadn't noticed before. A false bottom. She pried it open. Inside was a faded birth certificate, the name nearly erased by age. Name Margaret Anna Carter. Born April 9th, 1974. Mother Eleanor Carter. Father Daniel Carter. Claire's breath caught. The bride who vanished, Anna Collins, had a birth name she never knew existed. At the county archives, records confirmed what she feared. The Collins family had adopted Anna when she was just 2 years old. Her birth parents had died in a house fire, or so the papers said. But when Claire looked deeper, the fire report didn't exist. The Carters had simply vanished. Anna Collins was not just a missing bride. She was the last living heir of a family that had haunted Meadowbrook for generations. Claire's next stop was Eleanor Carter's old property, a crumbling farmhouse swallowed by ivy on the outskirts of town. Inside, it smelled of rot and damp earth. The wallpaper had peeled into ribbons, the air thick with the scent of dust and time. On a shelf, she found a ledger filled with names and dates. Each page documented marriages, every generation of Carter women, all ending the same way: bride lost before vows. And at the very back of the book, a final entry, written in shaky ink. Anna, June 7, 1996. The cycle completes. Claire's hands trembled as she flipped the page and found a photo tucked inside. It showed Daniel Carter, holding a little girl with bright eyes and curly hair. On the back, "My sweet Margaret, always remember our promise." Back in town, she met with Reverend Thompson, Meadowbrook's oldest living pastor, now 87, frail but sharp. "Claire, Reverend, what do you know about Daniel Carter?" Thompson: "Enough to wish I didn't. He built the old mill. Said the wood came from sacred trees, the ones by the river where the town began. Folks used to say his family had a pact, that no Carter woman could marry outside the bloodline. If she tried, something took her." "Claire, you mean a curse?" Thompson: "Maybe not a curse. Maybe a promise, kept by the wrong kind of love." The Reverend slid an old photograph across the table, the same symbol carved on the mill beams. A circle split by a line, like a wedding band broken in half. Thompson: "He said it meant eternity, but split apart, it meant betrayal." Later that evening, a new lead came in. A highway patrol unit found Mark Lawson's truck, abandoned near the Carter property. The driver's door was open, keys still in the ignition. Inside, Claire found a torn envelope. It was addressed to her, written in shaky pen. "Detective Monroe, if you're reading this, then you've seen the truth. She wasn't just missing, she was taken back. The Carters always come for their own. Look under the chapel floor. ML." Claire's pulse quickened. The chapel, the very place Anna was supposed to be married. That night, under floodlights, officers pried open the rotted boards beneath St. Luke's Chapel. The smell hit first: damp wood, earth, something metallic. Then the light caught it. A wooden box, wrapped in lace, sealed tight with rusted nails. When they pried it open, the sight made even the coroner freeze. Inside was a wedding dress, perfectly preserved, untouched by time. Folded within it, a lock of dark hair tied with ribbon, and a single wedding band engraved. MAC. Claire, recorder. Initials match the birth name Margaret Anna Carter. The ring predates 1996, possibly 1950s. Could belong to another missing bride, maybe her mother. But beneath the dress, Claire found something else. A photograph, faded but unmistakable. Anna, standing beside Daniel Carter, smiling. Except this time, Daniel wasn't older. He was the same age he'd been in 1978. A photograph that shouldn't exist. A man who should have been long dead. And a bride who might have never truly been lost, only reclaimed. Claire stared at the image under the light, tracing the outlines. Then she noticed something else in the background. Through the trees behind them, faint and blurred, the old mill. And on one of its broken beams, freshly carved, the same symbol, the broken ring. For nearly 30 years, the people of Meadowbrook believed Anna Collins ran away. But the truth was darker. She wasn't running from her wedding. She was being pulled back into a history written long before she was born. Then a faint echo of a woman's voice whispers in the background, "You promised. Every town has a place where its stories go to die." For Meadowbrook, that place was the Carter Mill, abandoned for over 60 years. Locals said it was haunted by the women who never made it home from their weddings. Others said it was haunted by something older, something the Carters had sworn to keep quiet. But when Detective Claire Monroe arrived at the site, she wasn't chasing ghosts. She was chasing a truth, one that refused to stay buried. The old mill sat on the edge of Carter Creek, its wooden frame sagging under decades of rain and rot. The wheel hadn't turned in years, yet the air still hummed with movement, a faint mechanical whine beneath the wind. Claire's flashlight beam swept across warped planks, broken machinery, and walls carved with initials. Some faded, some recent. And then she saw it, that symbol again. The broken ring, freshly scratched into a beam near the stairs. It was newer, maybe only weeks old. Claire, recorder. Symbol consistent with previous sightings at the chapel. Possible connection to recent intruder activity. No sign of Mark Lawson. Yet, inside the office, she found stacks of ledgers, inventory lists, grain receipts, family notes. But one book stood out. A red leather journal labeled, Millkeeper's Log, 1953. Its entries weren't about production. They were about people. June 7th, another one gone. The daughter of the Collins man. Taken before vows. July 4th, Reverend says the pact must hold. The blood seals the land. August 19th, Eleanor's turn next. Pray she won't run. Claire's breath hitched. The entries matched the missing women's reports. Every one of them disappeared within days of their weddings. She flipped further. The handwriting grew more frantic toward the end. October 2nd, the river rose. It tried to wash the chamber away. We sealed it again with iron. November 15th, he came to collect. Said the promise must continue. Said love is the only sacrifice that lasts. Then the last line, if I don't write again, tell them I kept the door closed. Behind the mill's rear wall, Claire noticed something odd. A faint draft, where no door should have been. She tapped the boards, hollow. When she pried them open, a staircase appeared, leading underground. Each step groaned under her boots. The air grew cold, damp, almost metallic. Her flashlight flickered. She descended anyway. At the bottom, a stone chamber, circular, lined with candles melted into stalagmites. And at its center, a stone altar carved with the broken ring symbol. On it lay a veil, brittle with age, and a silver locket engraved AC. As Claire recorded her findings, something shifted. The faint sound of dripping water stopped. And in the silence, a whisper. Faint, trembling, female. Voice. Faint you promised. Claire spun around, flashlight trembling. Claire. Who's there? Silence. Voice. Under the stone. He kept us there. She dropped to her knees, sweeping the light across the ground. The stone floor bore scratch marks, circular patterns, as if something had tried to claw its way out. With her gloves, she brushed dirt away and found a ring wedged between two stones. Gold. Engraved with the same initials she'd seen before, MAC. Her pulse raced. Claire, recorder. Recovered possible wedding band belonging to Anna Carter. Found at sublevel of Carter Mill. Audible voice heard. Possible hallucination from oxygen deprivation or stress. But she knew it wasn't a hallucination. Because as she turned to leave, her flashlight caught something on the far wall. A series of photographs pinned in a row. Every one of them showed a woman in a wedding dress. All different decades. All the same face. Anna's face. Narrator VO. Anna's face. In pictures that predated her birth by 50 years. A pattern that no camera should have captured. Unless the same soul had lived it over and over again. The final photograph was recent. Stamped with a date in red ink. June 7, 1996. The day Anna disappeared. But written beneath it, in fresh black marker. June 7, 2026. The vow returns. Claire raced out of the mill and called the station. Get me Chief Reynolds, she said breathlessly. We need that property sealed now. But before the chief could respond, her radio crackled with static. Then a voice, faint and male. Voice. Detective Monroe. You weren't supposed to open it. Voice. The door was closed for a reason. Claire froze. The line went dead. She looked up toward the trees. In the distance, a figure stood, barely visible through the mist. A man, tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. When she shined her light, he was gone. For decades, the Carter family's story had been one of tragedy. Brides lost before vows, love stolen by misfortune. But as Claire Monroe uncovered the truth, it became clear. This wasn't about bad luck. It was about keeping something contained. When Detective Claire Monroe first entered the chamber beneath Carter Mill, she thought she'd stumbled onto a relic, a piece of Meadowbrook's forgotten past. But the truth was older. Older than the town. Older than the mill. What she found there would rewrite everything she thought she knew about the bride who never made it to the altar, and the family that tried to keep her story buried. The following morning, Claire returned to the mill site with a forensic team. Local deputies secured the perimeter, but the townsfolk still gathered, whispering, crossing themselves, some leaving flowers near the bridge. It was the first time in decades that the Carter Mill had seen this much life. Inside, the forensics unit mapped every inch. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of tunnels beneath the main structure, extending far beyond the visible chamber. Claire and the team descended once more, this time with floodlights. The once shadowed space now glowed in cold, sterile white. On the far wall, symbols became visible, carved deeper than the rest. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a timeline. Claire, recorder. Symbols depict repeating sequence, dates every 30 years. Possibly ritual pattern connected to local disappearances. The earliest date, 1896. The latest, 2026. 30 years apart to the day. Each entry was paired with a single name. 1896, Lillian Carter. 1926, Eleanor Pierce. 1956, Mary Collins. 1986, Anna Carter. 2026, Claire swallowed. Anna's name had been added later, carved in finer, more modern lettering. And below it, in chalk, faint but legible, the vow must be renewed. As the excavation deepened, investigators found what everyone had feared. Fragments of human remains buried in the walls. Each skeleton bore remnants of bridal fabric. Lace, satin, veils turned to dust. The position of the bones suggested ritual placement. Hands folded over hearts, faces turned toward the altar. But one body was different. At the very center of the room lay a coffin, older than the others, sealed in iron. Etched across its lid was that same broken ring symbol. Only this time, it had been filled with lead, sealing it shut. When they pried it open, they expected to find another victim. What they found instead was empty, just a dress, perfectly preserved, white as snow, folded with care. And beside it, a small box containing a letter, written in faded ink. To the one who opens this, we did what we must to protect them. She wouldn't stop calling their names. If the vow is broken, she will rise again. At the lab that evening, Claire replayed her audio recordings from the chamber. She'd been careful to log every word. But this time, something new had appeared on the playback. A whisper. Not hers. Not anyone's on the team. Voice on tape, faint, Claire. Don't let them marry her. The hair on her neck stood up. She rewound the tape. The voice was still there. Claire, recorder. Unidentified female voice captured on audio during chamber survey. Source unknown. Could be residual sound artifact or unintentional interference. But Claire knew better. Back at the station, she dug through archived police files from 1986, the year Anna disappeared. Among the paperwork, she found something strange. A report stamped classified, signed by Chief Harold Reynolds, her own father. The file referenced unrecovered evidence from the original Carter case. Subject's personal effects, including veil and ring, placed in restricted storage, under directive of Meadowbrook Council. Her heart sank. Her father had known. And in the margin, handwritten in his familiar scrawl, "Don't let them open the well again." Claire visited her father that evening at the Meadowbrook retirement home. He was 86 now, frail but lucid, his eyes shadowed with the weight of things unsaid. "Claire, Dad, why didn't you tell me you were on the Carter case?" Harold, softly, "Because you wouldn't have believed me." Claire, "Then make me believe." He stared out the window, the sunset painting his face in red and gold. Harold, we found her dress, but not her body. Your mother said it was cursed, said it wanted her name next. We sealed the chamber to keep it from happening again. But the vows, they don't stay buried, Claire. Love like that never does. Claire clenched her jaw. Claire, you think it's starting again? Harold, no, sweetheart. I think it never stopped. That night, Claire returned to the mill alone. The moon hung low, pale and enormous over the water. The mill wheel creaked softly in the wind, turning as though by invisible hands. Inside, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. Fresh footprints in the dust. They led toward the altar. Her flashlight beam caught a flicker, a figure dressed in white standing by the wall. Claire froze. Claire, Anna. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply raised a hand, pointing toward the altar, and then vanished. Claire's knees weakened. She shone the light again. Nothing but shadows and dust. On the stone where the figure had stood, fresh words had appeared, written in chalk. It's not me you need to find. For Detective Claire Monroe, the Carter Mill case was no longer about a missing bride. It was about a pattern, one that stretched back generations. Every 30 years, another wedding, another disappearance, another vow renewed. And if the timeline was right, the next ceremony was only a year away. But as Detective Claire Monroe traced the Carter case deeper into Meadowbrook's history, the facts started to blur. Names repeated, dates aligned, faces mirrored, and somewhere in that tangled family tree her own name appeared. The morning after the mill encounter, Claire headed to Meadowbrook Town Hall, a stone building that smelled of dust, paper, and old secrets. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Avery, guided her to the archives. Avery, Carter, you say? You're not the first detective to go digging there. Claire, who else has been looking? Avery, quietly, your father. About 40 years ago. The files were brittle, handwritten in looping cursive, birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries. Claire's fingers trembled as she laid them out on the wooden table. And there it was, the connection she didn't expect. Lillian Carter, 1896, missing. Married to Thomas Monroe, date 1897. Her own family name. Claire blinked, tracing the line down the page. From Lillian came two branches. One ended abruptly in 1926 with Eleanor Pierce. Another continued through the decades, leading straight to her father. Claire, recorder. Confirmed genetic link between Carter family and Monroe lineage. Possible hereditary connection to missing brides pattern. She wasn't just investigating a cold case anymore. She was investigating her own blood. At the bottom of the archive box, Claire found a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings tied with string. Headlines spanning a century. 1896. Bride disappears hours before ceremony. Town blames river spirits. 1926. Eleanor Pierce vanishes. Police discover veil near creek. 1956. Young bride missing. Family mill closed amid scandal. 1986. Anna Carter. The bride who never made it to the altar. Every 30 years. Every time the same headline. Every bride descended from the Carter line. And the next one, by that pattern, would come due in 2026. A year from now. One photograph caught her eye, the 1956 case. A black and white image of the missing bride, Mary Collins, smiling shyly at the camera. But behind her, in the shadows, was a man's silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The same figure Claire had seen at the mill. Claire, recorder. Possible repeated subject across photographs spanning decades. Individual shows no signs of aging. May indicate family resemblances or staged reproductions. But she knew what she'd seen, and that silhouette had looked straight at her. That evening, Claire returned home and found an envelope on her doorstep. No postage, no handwriting, just a wax seal, pressed with the symbol of the broken ring. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The next bride is already chosen. You have less time than you think. Her phone rang moments later. The caller ID read, "Unknown. Claire." "Who is this?" Voice, male, distorted. "You shouldn't have gone to the mill." Claire. "What do you want?" Voice. "To finish what your father started." Pause. Voice. He knew the vow wasn't broken, only delayed. The line went dead. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Determined to find more, Claire visited the old Meadowbrook chapel, now half collapsed, its stained glass shattered by time. Inside, she found the parish records, including the journals of Reverend James Holloway, the town's priest in 1896. One passage stood out, dated June 7, 1896, the same day Lillian Carter disappeared. The union was forbidden. The bloodline cannot mix. The vow must stay within. The bride ran before the offering could be completed. The curse follows her kin. Another entry written years later read, "If love repeats every generation, so must loss. That is the price. That is the balance." Claire felt her stomach twist. Every 30 years, another bride. Another repetition of a broken promise. And the curse followed the Carter bloodline. Her bloodline. Back at her apartment, Claire spread out all the evidence, photographs, letters, maps of the mill, and her own DNA test results. The genealogy report was still open on her laptop. At the bottom, a notation she hadn't noticed before. Ancestral connection confirmed. Carter family, Meadowbrook Township, maternal. And beneath it, potential hereditary trauma marker, recorded in Monroe female line every third generation. The realization hit her like a freight train. She wasn't just connected to the case. She was next. That night, Claire sat alone in front of the mirror. Her reflection flickered under the dim lamp light, tired, hollow-eyed. And then, for just a moment, it changed. The reflection smiled. But Claire didn't. Voice, soft, echoing, "It's almost time, Claire." She gasped, stumbled back, and the lamp crashed to the floor, shattering. When she looked again, the mirror was cracked. But through the fractures, she could still see it. That faint white veil drifting behind her image. The deeper Claire Monroe went, the closer she came to uncovering the truth. But now, the investigation was no longer about the past. It was about her. A bloodline that began with Lillian Carter in 1896, and, if the pattern held true, would end with her. Before Claire Monroe could find the truth, she had to go back. Back to where it all began. Meadowbrook, 1896. A small farming town before the highways came, before the mill, before electricity. And before the legend of the bride who never made it to the altar, there was a woman named Lillian Carter. Lillian was 22. A quiet, radiant young woman known for her work at the local apothecary and her kindness to everyone in town. Her fiancé, Thomas Monroe, was a carpenter, the kind who built his own home from the trees behind his land. They were the kind of couple people pointed to and said, "That's love." Their wedding day was set for June 7, 1896. The invitations were handwritten. The chapel stood at the edge of Hollow Creek, its bell newly polished, ready to ring for joy. But on the morning of her wedding, Lillian never arrived. Her gown was found laid out across her bed, her shoes neatly beside it, and the door left open as if she'd simply walked out and never looked back. Sheriff Edwin Price led the first search. His notes, recovered decades later, read, "Bride missing from home between 5 and 7 a.m. No signs of struggle. Neighbor reports hearing singing from the woods. Female voice, unaccompanied." They found footprints near Hollow Creek, small, barefoot, leading toward the water. But halfway down the bank, they simply stopped. No body, no torn dress, no trace. Thomas Monroe refused to believe she was gone. He searched the woods for weeks, calling her name until his voice broke. Locals whispered that he'd gone mad, that he was seen talking to the trees, that he'd started digging near the chapel at night. And then, one night, he vanished too. His horse was found at the church gate, reins tangled. The bell had been rung 3 times, and at the altar lay a single thing. Lillian's veil, folded neatly, soaked in river water. Reverend James Holloway, the same priest whose journals Claire had found, conducted the investigation's final rites. But what he didn't tell the townsfolk was that Lillian had come to him the night before the wedding. His hidden letter, found behind the chapel cross a century later, read, "She was frightened, said she'd seen her mother in the mirror, whispering warnings, said the land didn't want her union, that her blood carried an oath she never made. She begged me not to ring the bell, said it wakes the ones beneath." The Reverend ignored her pleas. He told her that love conquers fear. The next morning she was gone. In the years that followed, the land around Hollow Creek became cursed in whispers. Farmers said the soil never yielded right where the chapel stood. Children dared each other to stand on the riverbank after dark to listen. They claimed they could hear a woman humming beneath the water. When the old mill was built decades later, workers found what they thought were old roots tangled in the earth, until one pulled free a strand of lace, and beneath it a lock of hair. Fast forward to 2024. Detective Claire Monroe sat in her apartment. The letter from Holloway spread out on her table. The candlelight flickered, illuminating the faded ink. She read the Reverend's final confession, one that was never meant to be found. "To whoever reads this, know that I failed her. I mistook the vow for faith, the ritual for love. The brides are not taken by man, nor by beast, but by promise. A promise made before this town existed. The first carter gave her blood to the land to save it from famine. Each daughter since his payment, every generation, to keep the harvest alive." Claire leaned back, trembling. The theory wasn't just superstition anymore, it was recorded by a priest. A blood offering, a generational vow. And if the cycle hadn't been broken, she would be next. The next day, Claire drove to the old chapel ruins by Hollow Creek. It was dusk. Fireflies drifted above the water, the air thick and sweet with decay. She stepped into the remains of the chapel, now nothing more than stone walls and moss-covered pews. The bell tower leaned precariously, vines curling up its spine. And then, she heard it. A voice, soft, female, singing the same hymn written in Holloway's notes. "Rest not, sweet bride, for the vow still binds. Rest not, sweet bride, for love rewinds." Claire's recorder crackled, static and whispers. Then a faint sound beneath it, like water lapping against wood. She turned her flashlight toward the creek. And there, half submerged in the mud, was a white lace veil, glowing faintly in the moonlight. As Claire knelt to pick it up, her light flickered, once, twice, then went out entirely. From the darkness came a single sound, the creak of wood, like someone stepping closer. She froze. Then, a whisper, inches from her ear. Voice, female, gentle, "You shouldn't have come back." Claire turned, but there was no one there, only her reflection, shimmering faintly in the water. For a split second, the reflection smiled. Then it disappeared beneath the ripples. Back at her car, Claire sat shaking, veil in hand. It was real, physical, not an illusion. She sealed it in an evidence bag and drove straight to the lab. Under UV light, faint letters appeared along the veil's hem, hand-stitched in white thread. "Till death unites, not parts." The old vow. The same words found in every missing bride's wedding program across the decades. That's when Claire understood what the Reverend meant. The vow wasn't about eternal love. It was about eternal possession. Lillian Carter's story was not just the first disappearance. It was the beginning of a ritual, one disguised as romance, sealed by faith and paid for in blood. And now, 130 years later, Detective Claire Monroe had found the proof. But proof doesn't break a curse. In fact, sometimes it awakens it. They say some foundations aren't built to hold homes. They're built to hold secrets. And in Meadowbrook, beneath the old Monroe Mill, the ground has been whispering for over a century. It was nearly midnight when Detective Claire Monroe parked her car at the foot of Monroe Mill, the same factory her great-grandfather had helped construct nearly 100 years ago. The mill had long been abandoned. Its windows were shattered, its brick walls slick with moss. The old river that once powered its turbines now barely trickled through a collapsed dam. But for Claire, This wasn't a visit to a ruin. It was a pilgrimage. She'd discovered something in the archives, a missing section from Thomas Monroe's construction plans. A room that didn't appear in any of the official blueprints. A sub-basement. No dimensions. No access point. Just one note in the margin, written in her ancestor's hand. Lay stone deep. Seal with mortar. Do not open. Claire stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was cold and thick with dust. Every footstep echoed like a heartbeat. She moved toward the back wall, where the newer brick met older, uneven stone. Her beam caught something strange. A patch of floor that sagged slightly, like a hollow beneath the wood. She knelt, brushing aside debris. A seam. A trapdoor nailed shut. Using a crowbar from her car, she pried at the boards. The nails screamed as they came loose, releasing a rush of cold air that smelled of damp earth and decay. She shone her light down, and froze. Beneath her feet was a staircase made of limestone, spiraling into blackness. Each step creaked beneath her boots as she descended. The air grew colder, heavier, until she could see her breath. The stairs ended in a circular stone chamber. The walls were lined with candles, or rather, where candles once were, their wax frozen into ancient stalactites. In the center stood a wooden chest, blackened by time. She brushed the lid. Dust bloomed into the air, and her fingers came away with faint flecks of red paint. On the lid, carved deeply, were two initials, L.C. Lillian Carter. Claire's heart pounded. She opened the chest slowly. Inside were scraps of decayed lace, pieces of a wedding gown, a bouquet of long-dead roses, and an envelope sealed with dark wax. For the one who carries my name. Claire unfolded the letter carefully. The ink had bled, but most of it was still legible. To the one who bears my blood, I was taken not by man, but by promise. They said the land would die if I refused. They said the vows were sacred, that my love would feed the earth. I believed them. I walked into the water and felt it breathe. But they lied. The land does not hunger for love, on the front, in shaky handwriting. It hungers for loss. If you read this, the vow still binds. The river keeps what it takes. And when it runs dry, it will ask again. End it, before the next bride is called. End it, or the water will turn red again. Claire's hands shook as she finished reading. She could almost hear her great-grandmother's voice, fragile, pleading, echoing across a century. She placed the letter back into the chest and noticed something else tucked inside. A small glass pendant, cracked and cloudy. Inside it was a single drop of dried red liquid. Blood. As she turned to leave, her flashlight caught something glinting behind the stone wall. She moved closer. A metal latch half buried in mortar. She brushed the dust away and tugged. The stone shifted, groaning against its own weight, revealing a narrow passageway. Beyond it, faint light. She hesitated. Her instinct screamed, "Don't go further." But the journalist in her, the detective in her, couldn't stop. She ducked inside. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls slick with condensation. Every step echoed louder than the last, until she reached what looked like a wooden door, half-rotted, bound with iron straps. Carved into it were the same words stitched into the veil she'd found. "Till death unites, not parts." She pushed the door open. Inside was a small chamber filled with water up to her ankles, groundwater from the old creek. And there, in the center, lay a coffin. Not buried, just resting in the water, sealed with black wax. Claire approached slowly, her breath shallow. Etched on the coffin's lid were two names, Lillian Carter, Thomas Monroe. Together, forever. She wiped away the film of dust and mud. Her fingers stopped when she felt the cold iron of a keyhole. Her heart sank. She remembered the key she'd found weeks earlier, tied to a note reading "The Last Chamber." She pulled it from her pocket. Fit perfectly. The lock turned with a sharp click. She opened the lid. Inside were two skeletons, intertwined, their hands clasped together, their skulls tilted as if resting against one another. It should have been peaceful. But as her light swept across their remains, something caught her eye. The bride's jaw, dislocated, twisted open, as if frozen in a silent scream. And the groom's hands, wrapped tightly around hers, the bones fused together by centuries of decay. She stepped back, horrified, her flashlight shaking. Then, from somewhere in the tunnel behind her, the bell began to ring. 3 times. Slow, deliberate. Bong, bong, bong. Her recorder flickered on by itself. Claire whispering, "No one's here. No one's supposed to be here." She turned to leave, but the passage behind her was gone. The stone had sealed shut. Voice female, faint, "End it, or join us." Her flashlight falls into the water. The screen cuts to black. Beneath the foundation of Monroe Mill, Claire Monroe uncovered more than a secret. She disturbed a promise written in blood. But if Lillian's warning was true, the vow still isn't broken. And now the river has started to rise again. Soft sound of water rushing faster and faster. Investigators arrive at the mill to find the site flooded overnight. And what they pull from the water shouldn't be there. By dawn, the rain hadn't stopped. The storm that rolled through Meadowbrook that night wasn't unusual for spring. But what it uncovered was the old Monroe Mill, once silent for decades, was now breathing again. And the river had brought something back. The next morning, deputies from the Meadowbrook Sheriff's Office arrived at the mill after receiving multiple 911 calls from nearby residents. They reported lights under the ground and a woman's voice calling for help. When first responders reached the site, they found the entire basement of the mill submerged under several feet of water. The ground above had partially collapsed, as if the river itself had clawed its way back inside. Detective Claire Monroe's car was still parked by the entrance. But Claire was gone. What they did find was her recorder, floating near the collapsed trapdoor, its red light blinking weakly. Officer Dawson, radio log. "We've recovered a digital recorder. Timestamp reads 1:43 a.m. The detective's vehicle is still on site. Area flooded, visibility poor. As they drained the first few inches of water, something surfaced. A small glass pendant, cracked, cloudy, the same one Claire had described in her field notes. Inside it, that same single dark drop. The following is a transcript of the recovered audio file, labeled Mill Investigation, Entry 43. Claire, whispering, found an underground chamber. There's a coffin. 2 bodies. Looks like Lillian Carter and Thomas Monroe. Hands are fused. Static. There's someone else here. I can hear bells. The water's moving. If anyone finds this, tell them. The vow, it wasn't." The recording ends abruptly at 1:47 a.m. 2 hours later, the storm broke. The water levels began to recede, and investigators returned to the site. In the shallows of the mill's basement, they found something that shouldn't have been there. Not Claire, not another skeleton, but a wedding dress. It was tangled in reeds and debris, soaked through but otherwise pristine. Lace still white, the fabric uniged. And pinned to the front of the bodice was a tag, the ink perfectly preserved. Anna Carter, April 1986. Anna Carter, the bride who never made it to the altar. The dress had been missing for almost 40 years. But there was no way it should have survived this long, untouched by time. Within days, the discovery made national news. Forensic teams were dispatched from the state capitol. Samples were taken from the dress, the pendant, and from the faint biological material found within the submerged coffin. The results sent shockwaves through the investigation. The DNA inside the pendant matched Detective Claire Monroe 100%. And the trace material from the coffin? It matched Lillian Carter. 2 women born more than a century apart, both connected by blood, and something else. The sample inside the pendant appears to contain partial degradation consistent with old hemoglobin, but the DNA itself shows modern preservation patterns. It's as though the sample was refreshed. The meaning was impossible to ignore. Whatever the Carters were bound to, it was still alive. That afternoon, investigators canvassed the surrounding properties, speaking with the handful of residents still living near the river. One man, Edgar Vance, a retired mechanic who lived 2 miles upstream, reported seeing something the night of the storm. Edgar heard church bells, clear as day. Thought it was thunder at first, but it wasn't. Then I saw her, a woman in white, standing in the water. Looked right at me. Interviewer: could you describe her? Edgar: pale, real pale, like her skin glowed. And her eyes. Her eyes were crying blood. Investigators dismissed the claim as shock or imagination. But when they reviewed drone footage from the flood site later that evening, one still frame made everyone stop. In the aerial shot of the riverbank, there was a figure, white, still, standing just beyond the waterline. And beside her, faintly visible, was the silhouette of another figure, a man, in a wide-brimmed hat. Later that night, while reviewing Claire's personal case files, investigators discovered a sealed envelope addressed to Deputy Hayes, her closest colleague. Inside was a handwritten note, dated 2 weeks before her disappearance. If you're reading this, I found it, the truth our fathers buried. My father wasn't investigating the Carters. He was protecting them. He believed the vow could only end with a blood witness. If I go missing, do not follow the river. It knows when you're coming. Attached was a photograph of a map, the original Monroe property lines. At the bottom of the map, circled in red ink, was a single word: foundations. Forensic techs reviewing Claire's digital recorder noticed something odd. Between entries 43 and 44, 1 full hour of corrupted data. It wasn't blank. It was scrambled, as if overwritten by hundreds of layers of static. But buried inside that noise was a faint sound. A human voice, repeating the same sentence. The vow holds. The bride remains. It wasn't Claire's voice. It wasn't Lillian's. It was male, old, measured. And at the very end of the file, one more voice, soft and trembling. I'm not gone. I just went where she went. The Carter's story began as a wedding tragedy. A bride gone missing. A small town haunted by what it lost. But now, the river has begun to give pieces of them back. Not as ghosts, but as reminders. By the time the search resumed, the river had pulled back into its bed. The mill stood silent again, but what it held beneath was still breathing. Detectives weren't just reopening a case. They were stepping into the dark heart of Meadowbrook's oldest secret. A week after the storm, the state investigation team arrived. Floodwater had drained, and what remained was the crumbling underbelly of the Monroe Mill. Its timbers slick with mud, the air heavy with mildew and decay. Detective Claire Monroe was still missing, but her note, and the map she left behind, had led investigators to one word circled in red: foundations. That word would change everything. Under the supervision of Sheriff Dalton Hayes, ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the mill floor. The results showed 3 hollow voids beneath the structure, chambers no one had ever documented. When the crew began drilling into the first void, the smell hit them before the air did. Old, earthy, metallic, like rust, and something else. They lowered a small camera down the borehole. The footage showed a narrow stone corridor, walls lined with strange etchings, candles melted into the floor, and in the center, a wooden chair, bound with rope. And sitting in that chair was what appeared to be a man's skeleton. Head bowed, hands clasped, still dressed in what looked like a pastor's robe. On the wall behind him, scratched into the stone, were words written over and over. She was promised. Sheriff Hayes on bodycam. Looks ritualistic. We'll need to get forensics in here immediately. Nobody goes down there until we secure the air levels. As they prepared to lower a second camera, a faint sound came through the feed. 3 slow knocks, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from somewhere below the chamber. By midday, excavation crews located a concealed hatch behind one of the old support beams. It led into a tight stone tunnel, just wide enough for one person to crawl through. Inside, the air was cool and still. The walls, though ancient, were smooth, carved deliberately. Halfway down, search teams found handprints pressed into the clay. Small, feminine. One of them smeared in something dark that later tested positive for iron-based residue, human blood. and etched beside the prints was a single phrase. He said I'd be safe down here. At the tunnel's end, a wooden door, sealed from the inside. It took hours for crews to break the seal without collapsing the chamber. When they finally forced it open, the air that rushed out was cold, unnaturally so. Inside was a small stone room, no more than 12 feet across. An old table, 2 rusted lanterns, and, impossibly, a modern police badge lying on the floor. Badge number 217, belonging to Detective Claire Monroe. Sheriff Hayes, quietly. She made it in here, but not out. On the far wall, there was a message scratched deep into the stone, uneven, written with what looked like a nail. I saw her. She's still wearing white. Later that evening, analysts reviewed the final 24 minutes of Sheriff Hayes's body cam. He had left it running as he and 2 deputies examined the lower tunnel. Midway through the footage, there's movement in the shadows, just a flicker at first. A reflection, then a shape. A figure standing at the end of the corridor. Still, motionless, wearing white. Deputy off camera. Is that a Sheriff Hayes? Light on her. Oh my God. When technicians enhanced the final frame, they saw something no one could explain. The woman's face was partially visible. Eyes open, skin pale. But what froze everyone in the room was the reflection caught in her pupils. It wasn't the deputies. It wasn't their flashlights. It was another face. A man's standing behind her. Back at the county archives, investigators recovered a set of documents connected to the original Monroe estate. Among them was a weathered leather-bound book belonging to Reverend Thomas Monroe, the same man whose remains had been found seated underground. The entries dated back to April 1886, the week of Anna Carter's wedding. She fears him now. I told her God would not forgive what she carries, but she swore she'd never run. I will do what must be done. The vow cannot break. If she disappears, they'll call it tragedy. But it will be salvation. I have bound her to him, not by love, but by blood. The river will remember. Forensic specialists analyzing the corrupted hour from Claire's recorder found another hidden pattern. A low-frequency signature, repeating every 7 seconds. When slowed down, it revealed something beneath the noise. A voice. Male. Calm. Reciting a passage. Those who vow before God shall not part, not in flesh, nor in death. And then, a whisper. Female. Barely audible. He won't let me leave. Beneath the Monroe Mill, time has no meaning. Every name, every face, stitched together by the same vow. Detective Claire Monroe may have vanished, but the walls still remember her voice. And somewhere below Meadowbrook, a woman in white keeps her promise. They thought the horror beneath the Monroe Mill had ended. But the first chamber was only the beginning, because hidden deeper underground, behind a wall of limestone and rust, was something the town of Meadowbrook had buried twice. Once in the earth, and once in their memory. 3 days after discovering Detective Claire Monroe's badge, the mill site was locked down by federal authorities. The FBI's evidence recovery team arrived with fresh lights, ground sensors, and oxygen scanners. The site was unstable. Every step caused a low groan in the beams above. Still, Sheriff Hayes refused to leave. He'd worked the Monroe case for half his life. He wasn't about to hand it over. When one technician remarked that the first chamber appeared deliberately built, Hayes asked the only question that mattered. Then where's the second? The scanner identified a second cavity, roughly 12 feet east of the first, sealed behind a dense wall of limestone. Shouldn't have been there. The surrounding foundation dated to 1890, but this wall was newer, poured sometime in the early 1990s. Almost a century later, whoever sealed it did it recently. That realization sent a chill through every investigator on site. Agent Rivera, FBI, bodycam. You're telling me someone came back here, not in the 1800s, in our lifetime. Forensic tech, and they didn't want this side found again. The team began cutting through the limestone wall. The process took hours. Each inch revealed a darker layer beneath. Concrete, dirt, and what looked like decayed fabric fibers embedded in the mix. When the final layer gave way, the smell rushed out first. Like burnt candles, like rot, and faintly perfume. Inside was a narrow stone corridor, the floor lined with rose petals long turned gray. At the far end stood an arched wooden door, its frame marked by symbols. Hearts, crosses, and infinity loops carved deep into the grain. One of the texts whispered, "It's like a chapel." The door creaked open. Inside, floodlights illuminated what looked like a wedding altar, small, crude, but unmistakably arranged for ceremony. A decayed wedding dress hung from a wooden crossbeam, swaying gently in the draft. Beneath it lay a skeleton, arranged neatly, one hand resting on a rusted bouquet of dried flowers, the other clutching a silver locket. The forensic team froze. The locket was engraved with a name, Anna Carter, and inside it a photograph, faded, water-damaged, but still visible. A young woman in her wedding gown, standing beside a man with piercing eyes. The same man from Reverend Thomas Monroe's journal, his own son, Daniel Monroe. When the locket was analyzed, investigators discovered traces of fingerprints preserved in its tarnish, matching Daniel Monroe's DNA profile from exhumed family records. The story that Meadowbrook had told for a century, that the bride ran away, that she abandoned the wedding, was a lie. She never left. She was taken, and the last person to see her alive was her groom. Love and possession often share the same language, but one ends with a vow, and the other ends in silence. Behind the altar, a small alcove was discovered, hidden behind loose brick. Inside it was a wooden chest, still sealed. When pried open, it revealed dozens of photographs, letters, and a tape recorder wrapped in cloth. The earliest letters were dated May 1954, decades after Anna's disappearance. They were written by Margaret Carter, Anna's younger sister. "To whoever finds this, please understand," he said, "she chose to stay. But I heard her voice that night. She was calling for me. If this is buried, it's because the Monroes buried her twice. Once in that dress and once in our family's shame. They said I was mad to dig near the old river road. But I saw the veil, white, still clean, floating against the current. I know she's still there." The tape recorder was corroded, but technicians managed to restore parts of it. The first voice was a woman's. Weak, shaky. "I can hear the bells again, every night before it rains. He's still waiting for me." And then, faintly in the background, the sound of a man humming the wedding march. Forensic specialists traced the limestone mixture from the second chamber. It matched a batch used by Elias Hawthorne Construction, the same company that renovated parts of the Monroe Mill in 1993. That name had appeared before in connection with the Meadowbrook disappearances, and the same man who'd been questioned decades later in the engaged couple case. Elias Hawthorne. He wasn't just a local contractor. He was a descendant of the Monroes, and the keeper of their promises. The circle was complete. 2 families, 1 vow, passed down like an heirloom no one wanted. Later that night, Sheriff Hayes sat alone in the field near the mill. He played the restored recording again over and over. At the end of the tape, just before the sound cut out completely, there was a small, almost imperceptible whisper. "The river remembers. Follow the bells." Hayes looked up and for the first time noticed the old chapel ruins upstream, their bell tower still intact, though long silenced. He turned to his team. "Sheriff Hayes, she's not buried here. Not all of her. The river took the rest." The bride's chamber revealed the truth of her death, but not the truth of her vow. Because somewhere beyond the mill, the water still carries her voice. And when the bell tolls again, someone always hears it. The night after the second chamber was opened, Meadowbrook was hit by the worst rainstorm in a decade. Lightning split through the valley, flooding creeks and washing away old roads. But when the water began to rise, it didn't just uncover the damage. It uncovered the truth. By dawn, the Mill Creek River had surged 3 feet above its normal level, swallowing fences, trees, and even parts of the old Monroe Chapel's foundation. Sheriff Hayes stood at the river's edge in his raincoat, his flashlight beam cutting across the dark, churning water. A volunteer search team had gathered nearby. Firefighters, divers, 2 FBI agents, all waiting for orders. The storm had loosened the banks, revealing parts of the ground that hadn't seen sunlight in 50 years. And floating near the shallows was something pale. First, they thought it was driftwood. Then the beam of light caught on fabric, torn lace, wrapped around the reeds. A piece of a wedding veil. Divers retrieved it carefully, laying it across a tarp by the embankment. Despite decades in the water, the lace was intact. Threaded into it were tiny silver beads, engraved with initials. C. Anna Carter. The same initials found on the locket in the underground chamber. The forensics team was stunned. The water had preserved it as though time itself refused to let it rot. Agent Rivera, FBI, said, "It's like the river kept her secret until now." Half a mile upstream stood what was left of the old Monroe Chapel, a ghost of its former self. Its bell tower leaned dangerously, bricks washed bare by years of rain. Local historian Ellen Pierce told investigators something that changed the tone of the search completely. That bell hasn't rung since 1954, the night of the wedding. But every spring storm since then, someone swears they hear it toll once. Just once. As if something or someone still called to be found. Around noon, as the rain eased, one diver surfaced shouting. Something had shifted in the riverbed. A wooden structure buried beneath mud and rock. The current had exposed a coffin-like box, wedged beneath an oak tree's roots. It wasn't a casket exactly. It was a carpenter's chest, about 5 feet long, sealed with rusted nails and heavy rope. Stamped on the lid, "Property of D. Monroe, 1954. The box was pulled ashore. Inside was what investigators later called the River Archive. Stacks of water-damaged photographs, a decayed leather journal, and beneath it all, a porcelain figurine of a bride and groom, their faces nearly worn away. But at the very bottom, wrapped in wax cloth, was something even more chilling. A bundle of bones. The remains were confirmed, within days, to belong to Anna Carter. Dental records matched perfectly. Her skull showed a single fracture, likely blunt force trauma. Her right hand was missing, presumed lost to the current years ago. When the locket from the chamber and the veil from the river were placed beside her remains, the picture became painfully clear. She had been buried twice. Once beneath the mill as a ritual, and once by the river as a secret. The wedding that never happened had become 2 funerals. One for love, and one for the truth. The journal found in the box belonged to Daniel Monroe, the groom who was never seen again after the wedding. Most of it was illegible, smeared with mud and river water. But one page survived, protected by the wax coating. It read, "She said the bells sounded wrong, like they were calling her somewhere else. Father said it was the land claiming what was promised. I only wanted her to stay, but she wouldn't walk through the door. So I built her another one, underground. And beneath that, in smaller handwriting, I hear them too, Father. The bells. They're never done ringing." The discovery of Daniel's journal reignited one question that haunted everyone. Where was he? No record of his death existed. No burial plot, no obituary, nothing. Reverend Thomas Monroe's final sermon in the church archives ended abruptly in mid-sentence, the very week of the wedding. Rumor had it he left town in the middle of the night and never came back. But then, 3 days after Anna's remains were identified, the team made one last discovery. Not in the river, but inside the bell tower of the ruined chapel. A trapdoor sealed shut with iron nails. And beneath it, stairs descending into pitch darkness. When they finally pried the door open, the air that escaped was cold and stale, like breath held for half a century. At the bottom of the steps was a narrow stone room, lit by a single shaft of sunlight through a crack in the ceiling. There, chained to the wall, were the skeletal remains of a man, still wearing a wedding ring. Nearby, a rusted hammer lay on the floor, along with a torn piece of fabric that matched Anna's veil. Pinned to the wall above him was a water-damaged photograph, the same one found in Elias Hawthorne's house decades later. It showed Daniel and Anna in the woods, looking back at the camera, fear in their eyes. Only now, something new was visible. a faint reflection of a third figure behind them, tall, robed, and unrecognizable. The river had given back what it took, both the bride and the truth she carried. But beneath the chapel, the groom was still waiting, not for love, but for forgiveness. And somewhere in the static of that storm, one bell still rang, just once, as if to say the story wasn't finished. When the river gave back the bride, it didn't just close one mystery, it opened another, because buried in the story of Anna Carter and Daniel Monroe was something older, something inherited, a vow that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with guilt. Investigators soon realized something chilling. The Monroe family wasn't just the town's spiritual foundation. They were also its builders, landowners, and record-keepers. Every deed in Meadowbrook traced back to one name, Reverend Thomas Monroe, 1889. He had purchased over 200 acres of land, including the riverbank, the mill, and the chapel. But one detail stood out. A section of land on the outskirts of town was listed not as owned, but as owed to another family, the Hawthorns. Town historian Ellen Pierce uncovered a century-old document known locally as the Meadowbrook Covenant. It was written between the two families after a drought devastated the valley in 1891. The Monroes, desperate to save their crops and church, borrowed heavily from the Hawthorns. But instead of paying in money, the contract listed something unusual: the offering of first vows and bell service, every generation henceforth, until the balance of the land is restored. No one understood what bell service meant, but the timing matched the first recorded disappearance in Meadowbrook, June 12, 1892. A wedding day. The church bell had always been a symbol of joy, rung for births, for weddings, for worship, but the Monroes had turned it into something else. In an old sermon transcript, Reverend Thomas Monroe wrote, "The bell is both blessing and debt, for when it tolls, the land is fed, and the drought ends. But silence it too long, and the land hungers." Local folklore spoke of the bride's toll, an omen that if the bell rang with no wedding to follow, a life would be taken before morning. It had become a story parents told their children, a ghost tale. But the truth was darker. The Monroes believed it, and they acted on it. The FBI task force cross-referenced old missing persons cases from neighboring counties. Over a century, at least 7 disappearances followed the same pattern. Always between May and July. Always someone engaged or newlywed. Always near water or the old Monroe properties. Each event corresponded with an old church record noting the tolling of the bell. It was as if every generation had chosen a sacrifice, one vow to feed the balance. Agent Rivera said, "It wasn't a curse. It was a ritual." The Hawthorns, the family owed the balance, didn't vanish into history as everyone thought. They stayed in Meadowbrook, changed their business name, and quietly profited from the Monroes' downfall. By the 1980s, the Hawthorns owned half the town, including the lumber yard, the mill, and the land where the river bends. Their last heir, Elias Hawthorne, was known locally as the caretaker. He oversaw the mill restoration in the early 1990s, the same time the second chamber was sealed. Elias claimed the land was haunted by old promises. When asked about the Monroes, he'd say only, "They stopped ringing the bell. That's why she never made it to the altar." After Elias's death in 2022, investigators found a sealed letter in his personal archive. It was addressed simply, "To the last bride." Inside was a single sheet of aged parchment, written in the looping script of his ancestor, Elias Hawthorne Sr., dated 1892. "The bell tolls not for those who wed, but for those who are taken. The land chooses its own, and we must obey, lest the balance fall and all be lost." Beneath it was a wax seal, the symbol of a cross entwined with a ring. The same symbol carved into the chapel wall where Anna's skeleton was found. During the investigation, the FBI recovered fragments of an old audio tape from the mill site. The voice on it was faint, distorted by time, but it belonged to a woman. "I saw them by the water. They said it was time for the vow. But she was crying. She didn't want to go. The bell was ringing, and the ground was shaking. He said it had to be done." Experts traced the tape's make and model to a 1950s field recorder, one often used by rural clergy to document sermons. Meaning, it could have been recorded by Reverend Thomas Monroe himself. By late 2023, investigators had pieced together a horrifying truth. The Monroes had carried on the vow for generations, believing they were protecting the land from famine and ruin. Each time the bell rang, another life vanished. When Daniel Monroe realized what his family had done, and that his father expected him to continue the ritual with his bride, Anna, he broke. He refused to offer her. The fight that night in 1954 wasn't over cold feet or betrayal. It was over a sacrifice. Daniel tried to save her, but by then it was too late. The land had already chosen. The truth of Meadowbrook wasn't written in blood. It was written in vows. For a century, one family's faith became another family's curse. And as the last bell fades across the river, a new question rises from the mud. How many brides were buried beneath the sound of wedding bells? For nearly 70 years, the chapel at Meadowbrook stood silent. Its doors locked, its bell rusted, its pews covered in dust. But silence doesn't mean peace. Because beneath the altar, something was waiting. In November 2023, investigators returned to the St. Agnes Chapel, the same place where Anna Carter's remains were found hidden behind the organ. They weren't looking for a body this time. They were looking for the vault. After studying the old architectural blueprints, Agent Rivera noticed something off. The foundation beneath the altar didn't match the rest of the church's layout. A square section of flooring, sealed in concrete, that shouldn't have been there. They started digging in the early hours of the morning, under floodlights and heavy rain. After 2 feet of concrete, the drill hit something different: wood, old, warped, and blackened by time. A hatch door, carved with the same cross and ring symbol found on the letter on the wall and on Anna's ring. It had been sealed with iron nails and pitch. When the team pried it open, the air that escaped was cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been locked away from the world for decades. Beneath the hatch was a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The steps were uneven, made of stone and clay. Agent Rivera described the smell as old earth and candle wax. Halfway down, they found fragments of lace, torn veil fabric, tangled around a rusted nail. At the bottom, their flashlights revealed a small stone chamber, and in its center a wooden table. On it lay a single, preserved wedding bell, the kind once tied to bridal bouquets. Beside it was an open ledger. The ledger's pages were brittle, yellowed with age. But the handwriting was unmistakable, the looping script of Reverend Thomas Monroe. Each page recorded a name, a date, and a short phrase. Mary Lou Thompson, the drought ends. Caroline Witt, the mill restored. Anna Carter, the balance kept. It listed 12 names in total, spanning from 1892 to 1954, all young women, all brides, all missing. The final entry was written in a different hand, shaky, faded. No more vows, no more bells. Signed Daniel Monroe. Against the far wall sat a small iron trunk, locked with 2 latches. When investigators forced it open, they found a stack of wedding photographs. Each one showed a bride, smiling, radiant, frozen in time. But when they turned the pictures over, the dates matched every disappearance listed in the ledger. And on the back of each photo, written in red ink, was the same word: paid. Inside the trunk was also a small reel-to-reel tape recorder. When restored by the FBI lab, it played a recording so faint that only fragments could be understood. A man's voice, Daniel Monroe's, trembling, broken. "I didn't want this. She loved me. She wasn't supposed to be taken. They said the water would rise again if I refused. But how could I? How could I give her to them? Forgive me, Anna. Forgive the land." The recording ended with the faint sound of a bell. One single toll, then silence. When they examined the bell on the table, forensic experts found an inscription on the inside rim: "Till silence rings again." It matched a phrase carved faintly into Anna's engagement ring, the one recovered from her remains. And in that moment, the pieces fit together. The Monroe family's vow wasn't about faith or sacrifice. It was about control. a twisted superstition that turned generations of love into atonement. Each missing bride wasn't chosen by fate, she was chosen by them. When news of the vault spread, Meadowbrook was shaken to its core. Families who'd lived there for generations discovered their ancestors were part of the cover-up. The chapel was officially declared a historical crime site. The ledger, photographs, and bell were sent to a state archive. For the first time in nearly a century, the old church bell rang again, this time not for vows, but for remembrance. For decades, the people of Meadowbrook believed the bride who never made it to the altar was a ghost story, a haunting meant to keep children indoors at night. But now they know it wasn't a myth. It was history, and as investigators prepared to close the case, one final discovery, hidden deep in the church archives, would turn the story again. A letter, written by Anna Carter herself. Every investigation has a breaking point, the moment when the evidence stops being cold, and the people in it begin to feel real again. For Agent Rivera and the Meadowbrook Task Force, that moment came when they opened an envelope, sealed nearly 70 years ago. In the dusty back room of the Meadowbrook County Records Office, a clerk was cataloging documents salvaged from the old St. Agnes Chapel after its closure. Among a box of faded hymn books and receipts for church repairs, she found a small white envelope, pressed flat between the pages of a prayer journal. The ink had bled through over the years, but a name could still be made out. To Daniel. The envelope was sealed with a small wax stamp, the same cross and ring insignia that had haunted this case since the beginning. Inside was a letter, written in delicate cursive. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Anna Carter. My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, it means the wedding did not happen the way we dreamed it would. I know now what you've been hiding, the stories, the whispers, the promise your family made long before either of us were born. They say love demands sacrifice, but not like this. Not through fear. Not through the taking of life. You told me once that the land remembers. I think you were right, but I also believe the land forgives, if we give it truth instead of blood. If you must choose between saving me and saving them, I hope you choose neither. Let it end here, Daniel. Let the silence ring one last time. It was signed simply, yours always, Anna. Forensic specialists later discovered faint writing beneath the visible text, as though Anna had started another note, then written over it to hide what she'd said. Using infrared analysis, investigators revealed a single hidden line beneath her signature. They're coming tonight. It was dated May 17, 1954, the night before the wedding. Investigators reconstructed the final 24 hours before Anna's disappearance. On the eve of the wedding, Daniel Monroe had been seen arguing with his father, Reverend Thomas Monroe, outside the chapel. Witnesses reported shouting something about not taking her and it ends with me. Later that night, lights were seen inside the church long after midnight. 3 figures, 2 men, 1 woman in white. By morning, only the men remained. The church bell never rang again. Inside the chapel vault, another document had been overlooked, a water-damaged notebook belonging to Reverend Thomas Monroe. The final page contained only one line. He refused the vow. The river will rise. That same week, a flash flood destroyed half of Meadowbrook's crops, a disaster locals later described as God's punishment. To the Reverend, the timing wasn't coincidence, it was confirmation. The final fragment from Daniel's tape, the one recovered from the iron trunk, matched the letter's tone perfectly. He sounded broken, remorseful. She told me to end it. I thought I could save her by keeping her from them. I thought I could hide her. But she begged me not to. She said the truth was her way out. No one knows exactly what Daniel did next, but experts now believe he may have sealed Anna's body behind the organ himself, not to hide a crime, but to keep her safe from the ritual his father demanded. A twisted act of mercy. When the letter was examined closely, a small watermark appeared on the paper's lower edge, initials barely visible in the light. MH. It didn't match Anna, Daniel, or the church's stationery. It belonged to Margaret Hawthorne, the midwife who had vanished 6 months after Anna. Inside her abandoned home, investigators found a half-burned stack of identical stationery and a note scrawled on the back of a torn page. The vow continues in the bloodline. Anna's letter wasn't just a goodbye. It was a warning, a plea to break a cycle of faith twisted into fear. And for nearly 70 years, that warning lay buried beneath dust, behind walls, beneath the altar, waiting for someone to finally listen. But as the case reached its final phase, one more discovery would shake Meadowbrook again. A wedding dress never worn, found in a place no one expected. For decades, the people of Meadowbrook avoided St. Agnes Chapel. They called it cursed, haunted, even sacred, depending on who you asked. But for investigators, it was simply unfinished business. A place where questions still hung heavier than the air itself. And now, that place was about to give up its final secret. In early March of 2024, the Forensic Recovery Unit returned to St. Agnes Chapel, the same site where Anna Carter's letter had been found just weeks before. The structure was unstable. Floorboards bowed under the weight of time, pews were broken and scattered, and a thick blanket of dust coated every surface. But as investigators moved toward the back of the chapel, one detail caught everyone's attention. High above the sanctuary, at the base of the old bell tower, a section of plaster had caved in. Behind it, something white shimmered faintly under a beam of sunlight that pierced the roof. At first, they thought it was a curtain. Then one of them realized what it really was. A wedding dress. A climbing team ascended the narrow spiral staircase to the belfry. There, suspended from a nail driven into the wooden beam, hung a pristine white gown, yellowed only slightly by age. The lace was delicate, the veil torn, but it was unmistakably the same design that Anna Carter had been seen wearing in her final fitting photographs. Tucked inside the bodice was a small dried bouquet, pressed roses and lilies, tied with a faded blue ribbon. And beneath that, something else, a folded slip of paper. On it, written in hurried pen strokes, were the words, "Forgive me, Anna, DM." The handwriting matched Daniel Monroe's. The ink, tested through spectrographic dating, was consistent with ink produced in the 1950s. He must have written it on the day of her disappearance or shortly after. Investigators began to wonder, was this his confession, or something else entirely? At the base of the belfry, they also found two sets of footprints preserved in the dust, one small, one larger. Both leading up the stairs, only one set coming down. Inside the chapel's old offering box, hidden beneath warped floorboards, was another discovery. A fragment of Daniel's diary. The entry read, "Father says the land is restless again. He says her name calls to it. I told him she's gone, that I sent her away. But the bells keep ringing, even when no one pulls the rope. If she's still here, I'll find her. And if she's gone, then may the sound take me too." At the top of the belfry, investigators found the old bell rope, frayed and brittle. It was tied with a knot looped twice and anchored to a rusted hook near the wall. Experts later determined that the rope had been cut from above, and traces of blood were found on the fibers. No body was ever discovered up there, but the pattern of the dust, the depth of the prints, the angle of the cut, it all suggested one haunting possibility. Daniel Monroe never left the belfry alive. For years, townsfolk had sworn they heard the church bell ring on certain nights, especially in spring, around the anniversary of Anna's disappearance. Investigators once dismissed those claims as superstition, sound carried by wind or wildlife knocking against the rope. But when engineers surveyed the bell tower, they found that the clapper, the inner metal piece that strikes the bell, had long been removed, couldn't have rung. And yet, recordings taken from the team's overnight surveillance captured a faint, rhythmic tone, matching the bell's frequency exactly. 3 slow chimes, the same number of tolls used in 1954 to signal a wedding's beginning. After the discoveries were catalogued, a memorial service was held on the chapel grounds. Locals, many now in their 70s and 80s, came forward for the first time in decades. Some spoke about Anna, others about Daniel. A few still whispered about the vow, the old belief that the Monroes had carried for generations, the one Anna's disappearance had supposedly broken. When the last speaker finished, an elderly woman approached the microphone. Her name was Margaret Hawthorne Jr., the daughter of the midwife who had disappeared in 1955. She held something small in her hand, a silver locket tarnished with age. Inside was a photograph of Anna in her dress, smiling. On the back were 4 words etched by hand. She made it home. The discovery of the dress should have closed the case. It should have ended the questions, silenced the whispers, brought peace to a town haunted for 70 years. But peace doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it comes with new questions. Because 2 weeks after the memorial, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the county sheriff's office, and signed, unaddressed, postmarked from Meadowbrook itself. Inside was a photograph of the chapel, and standing in its doorway a figure in white. 2 weeks after the memorial at St. Agnes Chapel, a single envelope arrived at the Meadowbrook County Sheriff's Office. No return address, no note, just a single black and white photograph, and 1 word typed on the back. Look. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a grainy shot of St. Agnes Chapel taken from the road at dusk. The windows glowed faintly, like candlelight flickering from inside. But when investigators zoomed in, they noticed something no one could explain. Standing in the open doorway was a figure, a woman, wearing what appeared to be a wedding dress. The outline was faint, slightly blurred by motion, but the shape of the veil, the train of the gown, even the way the hands folded gently in front, it all matched perfectly with the dress found in the belfry. Except that dress was now locked inside an evidence vault. Forensics dated the film stock used in the photo. It wasn't from the 1950s or even from an old camera. It was recent. Developed with modern chemicals, the print was estimated to have been taken no more than 3 weeks earlier, just days after the memorial. Whoever sent it wanted the investigators to see it, but not to find them. Sheriff's deputies canvassed the area, checking every local film developer and photography studio within 50 miles. None had processed that image. None recognized the handwriting on the envelope. But one store clerk mentioned something odd. A man in his 60s, tall, quiet, who'd come in a week earlier asking if the shop still sold night film. When shown a composite sketch, a retired archivist from Meadowbrook Historical Society identified him immediately. That's Michael Monroe, he said. Daniel's nephew. He used to live by the Chapel Road. Investigators visited the Monroe property, a crumbling farmhouse 2 miles from St. Agnes. The windows were boarded, the mailbox overgrown with ivy. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and something else, the faint, unmistakable smell of developing chemicals. In the corner of a small back room sat a makeshift darkroom. On the clothesline, photographs hung in rows. Each one showed the same thing, the chapel, taken from different angles on different nights. But in nearly every photo, there was someone standing in or near the doorway. Sometimes clear, sometimes just a blur. Always in white. And in one frame, the last one taken, she wasn't in the doorway anymore. She was closer. On a small cassette player left near the sink, detectives found a recording. The tape began with the sound of breathing, shaky, uneven. Then a man's voice, trembling. I didn't mean to find her. I just wanted to prove the stories were wrong. But she's still there. Every night around 9:15, the same time the bells used to ring. Sometimes she's in the window, sometimes the door. But last night, she looked right at me. Then silence, and a faint sound of distant bells. 3 slow chimes. The tape was dated March 21, 2024. The next day, neighbors reported seeing a single light in the chapel tower, flickering on and off for nearly an hour before going dark. When deputies went to question Michael, his house was empty. His car was still there, his camera bag still on the table. Only his boots were missing. A search of the surrounding woods turned up nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle. But on the chapel steps, just before dawn, someone found a wet footprint, bare, small, and smeared across the stone. Later, digital analysis revealed something that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. In the lower corner of the original photo, half hidden in shadow, was the faint outline of another figure. A man, slightly turned away, reaching toward the woman in white. His sleeve pattern matched that of a vintage 1950s tuxedo. And when investigators enhanced the reflection in the chapel's glass window, they saw two faces, side by side, smiling, Daniel and Anna, together, just as they were meant to be. In a town built on vows, Meadowbrook has learned that some promises don't die with time. The investigation into the photograph remains open. Michael Monroe was never found, and St. Agnes Chapel stands as it always has, quiet, empty, waiting. Locals say on spring nights, when the air is still, the bell sometimes rings 3 times. And if you look closely through the chapel window, you might just see them, a bride and groom, standing together, forever waiting for a wedding that never began. Time moves differently in Meadowbrook. Years fade into decades, and the past never really leaves. It just waits for someone to listen. In 2025, nearly 70 years after Anna Caldwell's disappearance, St. Agnes Chapel was finally restored. What was once a crumbling relic became a quiet memorial, rebuilt by locals who grew up hearing the stories whispered by their grandparents. The belfry was cleaned, the pews repolished, the windows replaced. But there was one thing they couldn't fix: the bell. Every attempt to lift or restore it failed. The chains rusted, the pulley jammed, the mechanism cracked. And yet, on certain nights, the townspeople still heard it ring. 3 slow, perfect chimes. No one could ever explain how. During the final phase of the restoration, a crew clearing debris from the cellar found a sealed stone compartment behind the foundation. Inside was a small tin box, wrapped in decaying fabric. And within it, a wedding ring. The inscription inside read, "My heart waits for you, D." The ring matched the one Daniel wore in his engagement photo, the same ring never found when his remains were discovered years later in the lake. Alongside it was a faded letter, the ink nearly erased by time. Only fragments were legible. It wasn't supposed to be that night. The car, the bridge, the light in the woods. "Forgive me." The signature at the bottom was trembling, barely readable. But it was hers. Anna Caldwell. Historians and true crime writers have debated the Meadowbrook mystery for decades. Some believe Anna's letter was a confession, that she fled after a tragic accident and never returned. Others argue it was something stranger, that both she and Daniel became bound to the chapel through the unbroken promise of their wedding vows. But for those who've lived in the town long enough, it's not about what happened. It's about what still lingers. In the summer of 2026, a caretaker named Leah Hayes took over maintenance of the chapel grounds. One night, while locking up after a late wedding rehearsal, she heard faint footsteps on the stone path outside. She turned off her flashlight, listening. Then, through the stained glass, she saw 2 silhouettes. A woman in white, a man beside her. They stood hand in hand, motionless. The woman turned her head slightly, toward Leah, and for a moment, their eyes met through the colored glass. Then a gust of wind blew through the chapel. The candles flickered out, and the figures were gone. When Leah stepped outside, she found only footprints, leading from the chapel door to the edge of the woods and disappearing into the grass. No one ever saw them again. But that night, just past 9:15, the town of Meadowbrook heard something it hadn't heard in years. 3 clear chimes from the chapel bell. No wind, no mechanism, just the sound of a promise kept. Maybe the story of Anna Caldwell and Daniel Monroe was never about disappearance at all. Maybe it was about devotion, the kind that refuses to end, even when everything else does. And maybe, somewhere beyond time, a bride finally walked down the aisle and found her groom waiting,